Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of 100 Yards of Football, along with Vincent Turner, our host, and Jeremiah Long, our engineer. I'm Harper LeBel. We want to welcome you today to a very special show, especially if you're a local here in the Atlanta area or the state of Georgia. The first one to play for the Falcons, who is a legend, is Tommy Nobis. It's arguable, and there are many people that have different opinions, but the next great Falcon is our host that we're going to talk about today is Steve Bartkowski. And what a great career that he had. Certainly a guy that would change the altitude of the Atlanta Falcons. They were a perennial loser prior to that. Just ask any of the players that went against the Falcons. You didn't even have to study all that hard. But Steve Bartkowski was one of the first Falcons to change. Big guy, 6'4", many would argue 6'5", 225 pounds, had a rocket for an arm. We'll talk a little bit about that. But Steve grew up in the Iowa district here in the state near Des Moines. And after his early days of developing as an Iowa, they would move to Santa Clara, the Bartkowski family would. And that's how he ended up at the University of California. And Vincent, if we're going to talk about a difference maker, especially in Georgia, especially in the mid 70s, you have to include Steve Bartkowski.
There's no question about it. And I like your opening lines. Back in the day when the Atlanta Falcons, I think, came in the league in 1966, they were an expansion franchise. And no disrespect to you, Harper, this morning. No disrespect to all the other Falcon legends out there. But losing was a high level. And Tommy Nobis was having a great career, but the Falcons were losing games. When Steve Bartkowski came on the scene, two things happened. We knew the Falcons were eventually going to be a winner. He was a guy, as you just said, had a big-time arm, and he was good-looking. All that came together. And what I remember about Steve Bartkowski, I knew a little about him when he was at the University of California. I was in the ninth grade, going to Sherwood Junior High, and I was a big-time college football fan. But I was following the Florida Gators because the Gators were picked to really be a team that can challenge for the SEC championship that year. They had Don Gaffney, Jimmy DuBose, Tony Green. But I didn't know nothing about the Cal team. But after that football game, Steve Bartkowski had 162 yards. And as we talked about in the pre-show meeting, they had a guy with the glasses. I think his name was Chuck Muncie. But I knew after that football game, there you go, I knew after that football game that Steve Bartkowski was a very special talent. Florida ended up winning that football game 21-17. September 17th, 1974, and that's when I heard of Mr. Bartkowski. Then going throughout the season, at the end of the day, Bob Hope used to have that Christmas All-American team, right?
Yes.
And I saw Joe Washington on that team, Archie Griffin, a true sophomore out of New Jersey, Richard Batman Wood, you know about him, Harper,
Sure
Pat
do.
Thomas, Jimmy
Right on.
Webb, the legendary Randy White, Leroy Salmon. Steve Bartkowski was the quarterback. Then I said, I'm going to start following this guy. Then the draft happened. He went first overall. Robert Bazile was in that draft. Sweetness. Do I have to say his two names? Walter Payton. Jimmy Webb that played in Mississippi State. That was out of Mississippi around the Memphis area. Russ Francis, Fred Dean, Rick Upchurch in that draft. So I started really following Mr. Bartkowski. But then when Mr. Bartkowski came on the scene, and I knew that eventually he was going to turn this franchise around, 1980. You know more about that than I do, Harper. They went 12-4. And then January the 4th, 1981. Now, everybody was saying this was a Super Bowl team, and they had the Dallas Cowboys down by 10 points going into the fourth quarter. That Cowboys team, they had Danny White, Dorsett, Newhouse, and the Falcons ended up blowing that game in the fourth quarter. And Danny White, he drew Pearson on a 23-yard strike. The rest is history. Back to you, Mr. Harper, to talk about your great alumni teammate.
Well, Steve went to the University of California, and he was a freshman in 1971. And back then, you could not play if you were a freshman. I always give the credit to the Marshall University plane crash as being the single difference maker. Marshall lost 75 players and staff and personnel in that horrible incident that took place. And their surviving team was a bunch of sophomores and a bunch of freshmen that they were going to have to recruit to replace that roster. And so the NCAA allowed for freshmen to play after 72. But Steve didn't get to play his freshman year. Threw a lot of picks for a young guy as a sophomore and as a junior. And his senior year, he finally turned it around. He said during that time, and I've spoken to Steve on numerous occasions, have had a chance to interview him several times over the years, that he could stand on the goal line and that he could throw a football over 100 yards. He said 102 is the farthest he ever got, but he had a very strong arm, which helped him not only as a quarterback, but he was a very good baseball player in college too. He ended up playing first base mostly, but I would have put him in right field because that rocket arm that he had, who's going to run and try to get an extra base and leg a double into a triple if you hit the ball into right center? They wouldn't do it against Steve because his arm was so strong, but a dual athlete. And another thing that happened while he was at Cal Berkeley, he struck up a relationship with a young law student named Lee Steinberg. And the two of them were friends. And when Steve ends up getting drafted by the Atlanta Falcons, he asks Lee to be his agent. And Lee was still studying law, and he probably would have had a completely different career had he not met up with the young Steve Bartkowski. And the two of them developed a relationship, and Steve was his first client. And how did that work out for you, Lee? It's pretty good. There isn't a quarterback or even a high-rated player that wouldn't want to be under your guidance. So that's one of the few things. And Steve enters a career in Atlanta at a time where they really needed a change of quarterback. They had several other quarterbacks in their roster. Many Falcon fans will remember names like Bob Lee, Pat Sullivan, Kim McQuilkin. He's one that I didn't remember. Bob Berry, Randy Johnson was on the roster there early. Terry Knopfsinger, a couple of guys that didn't end up playing quite a bit. But Steve Bartkowski was one of the ones that really changed that forever. Jeff Van Note was one of the guys that would be a perennial All-Pro as an offensive lineman, and he would be the center for Steve during all of his career. But another name, a tackle named George Kuntz, who ended up being the trading bait that allowed for the the Baltimore Colts and the Falcons to switch spots. They ended up trading picks, and Steve, who would have been a third pick overall if he had gone to the Falcons there, ended up being the first pick because of that trade. So coming to the Falcons, getting started, he had a knee injury. He had several. You can see in the picture on the right there in the white uniform that his right knee is a little bit bigger than his left. If you just do a comparison, a knee brace would be a part of his career, and the numbers speak for themselves. The honors speak for themselves. But Vincent, you were right. In 1978, the team started turning things around. So Steve's third year. In 1980, they had that playoff game, and 82 was the final one that was a part of Steve's career. The Falcons back in those days had never put together two back-to-back winning seasons. They would win a few games in one year. For example, in 78, 79 was terrible. 80 was a really good year, obviously. That's when Steve became a Pro Bowler. He threw for over 3,000 yards, which was absolutely unheard of back in those days. Wallace Francis, Junior Miller, William Andrews, of course, catching the balls out of the backfield. Lynn Kane was a part of that team. There were some great Falcons that were on that roster, and they end up going to the playoffs. Vincent, I'll leave it there for right now. I've spoken way too much about Steve, but those are some of the things that I remember about the early years that he had from the 70s to the early 80s.
Well, like I said, when you look at an organization that had done a lot of losing, there's a time in the organization that you get that one player that can get you over the hump. And Bartkowski was that guy. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to talk about what he done on the field. What I got more respect for him, and I didn't know this until I was doing my research on Mr. Bartkowski last week. I didn't know Harper, he was a stage 4 colon cancer guy that beat that. To me, that tells more just about on the field. That tells me, man, you got a lot of heart, man. And God was in your plan. And I know a lot of friends of mine, several of my friends have passed away from colon cancer. Kudos to you today, Mr. Bartkowski. Not only was you an outstanding player on the football field, both for the Cowbears and Atlanta Falcons, But here at 100 Yards Football, we got to give you much love on that for you still being here with us and still at your age, still a really good-looking guy. Back to you, Mr. LeBel.
Yeah, Steve nowadays is with his sons running the Ruby Drake Ranch. If you go to Twin Bridges, Montana, which is in the southwestern portion of the state, you can look it up. Steve, they've got Steve and his sons. They have a lodge and a ranch, and it's some of the best fly fishing you'll ever be a part of. Steve was an outdoorsman. That was a part of who he was when he grew up in Iowa. You'd go pheasant hunting, you go goose hunting, you could fish, or go out for deer or elk or whatever else is in the area. Steve was an avid outdoorsman, and after he was done playing football, he took that as a part of his life. And the lodge itself is a great place for you and a bunch of your buddies if you want to go and have a great weekend or a week of fantastic fishing or other types of hunting that are available in that area. He would gladly host you, and I'm sure you might get a couple of stories out of that. But again, the first portion of Steve's career here in Atlanta met by a weak offensive line, to say the least. Nothing against any of the players, but the results speak for itself. And he had 7 knee surgeries prior to ending his career with the Los Angeles Rams in the mid-70s, mid-80s. Talented, great player at a time when quarterbacks were just starting to get some recognition. You know, Archie Manning was a part of the New Orleans Saints, and everyone will say that Archie ended up running a lot more than he did passing. He was running for his life because he didn't have a whole lot of protection. Did a little research. Allow me just for a second. In the 1971 draft, where the New Orleans Saints picked up Archie Manning as the number 2 overall pick, listen to some of the names that came out of the 1971. Jim Plunkett, who was the number 1 player overall. He went to the Boston Patriots. They weren't the New England Patriots back then. Archie Manning. Dan Pastorini was a first rounder. Lynn Dickey was a 3rd rounder that went to Houston also. They were so concerned about the quarterback position in 1971 that the Oilers ended up picking 2 quarterbacks in their first 3 picks. Ken Anderson was also a part of that, and we're going to call him Joe Theismann, not Heisman. He went to Miami, didn't like the contract terms. Maybe he needed Lee Steinberg also, but he ended up going to the Canadian Football League and then eventually became a Washington Redskin. But quarterback positioning started becoming a little bit more important, and by 1975, when Steve was a part of the draft there, number 1 pick overall, it was at a time where the game was changing right before our very eyes. So Steve Bartkowski, obviously a great part of the Atlanta Falcons history. Number 10, you'll still see jerseys worn by young and old that have his number. It hasn't been retired, but he's obviously in the Ring of Honor. And another thing about Steve, after he was done, he was so trusted that Arthur Blank ended up naming him to his board. He was a part of the 12 people supervisory crew that was assisting in making some of the big decisions, including putting together Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Steve tells me a story once, and I didn't know this. When the Dome first opened, there was a problem. It was delayed a little bit. There were some issues that were going on. For example, the halo board that was around it was made of glass. In the corners, it's bent. And if you bend glass, it has a different optical effect that would be on your ability to assess things. And obviously, because it was a halo, it's round, they had some issues. They built one. It didn't look right. They changed it. Arthur Blank said, we got to make it better. First technology of this type, and Steve was telling me the story about how they had to redo the whole thing, and that was one of the reasons that the Mercedes-Benz Stadium was delayed like it was. Another was the roof. I asked him about it at one point. I go, what is the deal with the roof? Are they going to open it? Are they going to close it? How is that working? He goes, they can open it all right, but when they close it, these giant beams that are a couple hundred feet across from one another, they wouldn't meet. 17.58 degrees on one side, 17.58 degrees on the other. And when you're at a span of 200 feet or more, they would close and they were about 3 or 4 inches off. So they had to close it and then seal it so that it remained watertight. But then when they opened it up again, they had that same problem of when they closed. They finally got it right. If you guys will recall, Atlanta United soccer team ended up having a few games that were delayed. They had to play a bunch of their games on the road. It was finally open. The Falcons were in it. The Corky Kell Classic and everything else that's a part of the Mercedes-Benz arena and the experience there. It was delayed, but they finally got it right. Vincent, back to you.
My final words about Mr. Bartkowski this morning. That was great information. I didn't know Steve Bartkowski was Mr. Steinberg's first client. That's awesome this morning. I did not know that. My final words on Steve Bartkowski, I always going to remember from the 1975 draft, man, being the first pick and all those great players that was in the draft with him. Sweetness, Bazile, Dean, Upchurch, the young man out of the University of Maryland, Randy White, and the legend himself, one of the greatest kick returners in the game, Rick Upchurch, out of the University of Minnesota. My final words today on Mr. Steve Bartkowski, legend Atlanta Falcon. Back to you, Mr. LeBel.
Yeah, you mentioned Randy White. George Scott was an offensive lineman. Many folks will remember Ed Too Tall Jones tiptoeing down the line of scrimmage. The Falcons had a 3rd and short, and Steve went on 2. He said, hold your water, ready, break. They ran the play. They went on hut, the first one. Ed Too Tall ends up skating down the line to avoid going offsides. Today, he would have been obviously flagged, but the way things were, George Scott had one of the best blocks of his life. He moves Randy White completely out of the way. The give is to Lynn Kane. Lynn runs into Ed Too Tall Jones, who went unblocked because he was not where he was supposed to be. He was skating down the line. Falcons have to punt. And one of the days in history, in Atlanta sports history, that is January 4th, 1981, everybody lets out a sigh of, oh, I can't believe we lost that game to the Cowboys. Steve himself said, we had beaten the Philadelphia Eagles a couple of weeks earlier in the regular season. They had manhandled them in Philadelphia. And the Eagles ended up winning their playoff game. They got to host the Cowboys. They beat them badly. They go to the Super Bowl. They lose to the Raiders. And every single Falcon I've ever had a chance to interview says, we should have been in that game. We should have beaten, woulda, coulda, shoulda, right? Should have beaten the Cowboys. They would have beaten Philadelphia. They'd done it earlier. And then obviously they had a chance to play the Raiders, who they felt that they could match up against them a lot better than what Philadelphia did. So the woulda, coulda, shoulda Hall of Fame, Steve Bartkowski's in it. Atlanta fans know and recognize him as the single best quarterback to change things. He was the first to be their hero. So for Vincent Turner, for Jeremiah Long, our producer, I'm Harper LeBel saying thank you for tuning in to another episode of 100 Yards of Football, where we honor the legends. Today we honored Steve Bartkowski. Thank you for watching, everybody. Have a wonderful day.